Right now, I'd like to make a whole new section because we're going to start exploring something different. We're going to explore forms. I didn't need two, I meant H2. So let's see, form tags we'll call this. And I want, while we're working on this, for the old section to go away. So for that, I'm going to add an attribute to this, hidden. And so that section we were just playing with before, where we were playing with new tags, the list tags, will now go away, whereas the form tags one will be visible. This is just a way to clean up after ourselves. So now all I see is form tags. Just something handy that you can do. And it also shows this hidden tag. You can apply the hidden attribute to any tag you want, and it will hide that tag. And anything inside of it, of course, which includes the entire section. So now let's go in here. Let's talk about forms. A form is really meant to be an analogous thing to something you'd fill out on a piece of paper. There are usually labels that explain what sort of data it wants, and then some sort of area where you are meant to provide that data. If you have ever done your taxes by hand, you're probably very familiar with the IRS 1040. I can type in 1040, it's so ubiquitous it comes up right away, and the very first link is in fact that 1040 form. So here it's asking me the label for my first name and initial, and then right here I would fill that in, and then your last name, and you would fill that in, and if you have a spouse of some sort, you would fill that in here. This is a paper form, and HTML forms are meant to echo that. They very much provide you a mechanism for providing a label and then a place to provide the data. This will be called a label, in fact, and the data area will be called an input, because this is where data comes into your page. Now, forms can be very complicated. We're going to try and keep it simple. We're going to point out a few basic things here on your 1040. You'll see a lot of these kinds of inputs on a 1040. These are basic text inputs where I can type with the keyboard and fill in data. You'll also see things like this. These are checkboxes. Checkboxes are very common. You would normally hash it with a pencil and check it off. And occasionally, I don't know if there's any on the 1040, you'll have some things that are just buttons that trigger an event of some sort. Like if this could be submitted electronically, perhaps they'd have a button at the bottom that I would click, and that would submit the form. If you've ever done your local state taxes, I believe it's the Wisconsin 1 form. Let's see, yeah. Can we find this real quick? Yeah, DR, individual income tax, form 1ES, fill-in form. That sounds good. This always has to be downloaded and opened in something specific. I'm just going to do this to show my full example here. Where was it? What was it called? It's called 2017. Am I crazy? There it is. We open this with Adobe Acrobat. Because then it will look correct. If you open it in preview on Mac, which is what they default to, it doesn't look right. This does all kinds of cool things. This form is totally electronic. And here we have buttons where I can print, clear, save. I can attach more things if I want to. There's lots of different things that you can create here. This is a very sophisticated form that you can fill out. What we want to be able to do is to create those same kinds of forms only as a web page. Let's take a look at exactly what that would look like. Inside here, the first thing you want to do is if you have a collection of form tags that you're going to be making, you want to delimit it, just like you do sections or headers or footers. And not surprisingly, the typical way is to say form. That's your tag. Inside of form, you need to specify all of your different labels and inputs. So let's create a label. And the label can then surround the text you want. Let's say first name. And then you would have an input tag, INPUT. Input tags are always self-closing. And if you're going to use a label, you usually want the input tag inside of the label. I'll show you an alternative form of that eventually. Input tags receive information, so they don't need to have anything inside of them. There's no content, no text that you would provide to it. But they really depend on attributes. You very much need to know what sort of attributes you're going to specify. And the most important one for an input tag is type. As we do this, we have lots of different options available to us. Once again, let's go back to our reference here from W3 Schools, and let's go find the input tag. HI input. Input tags have lots of attributes that you can specify. So when you get to the attribute table, don't be overwhelmed. There's a lot there. We just want to go right to type. And don't be overwhelmed by this either. Most of these are things you don't use. They are things that are there to support future extensions and things like that. What we want to do here is pick out a few of these. Text is a really common one, so we would keep that handy. Button, checkbox, those are also really common ones. Some of these other ones like email, image, range, these are all a little more complicated, so you may or may not want to use those. Some of them aren't fully supported in all browsers yet, and some of them don't intend to ever be supported. They were created by the people who created the HTML standard in order to provide some room to grow in the future. But button, text, and well, there was another one. Button, text, and checkbox are the key ones that you will use. Another one that you'll commonly use, we'll learn more about this eventually, is radio. You also might use password. This is a text input where you want it masked so that you see stars instead of the actual characters you're typing in. Other ones I've used myself. Email can actually be useful, but don't expect it to work on every browser. Number can be usable, but again, don't expect it to work on every browser. And then submit. But we'll learn a different way that we specify submit. In fact, all of our buttons will be specified slightly differently. But I'm getting ahead of myself. For now, let's go with text. We're asking them for their first name. We want text. We don't really need to give this anything else at this point. We just leave it there like that. Let's go ahead then. We need to specify, whenever you specify a form, it's required that there's some way to submit the form. We're going to do that with a button. Now you'll notice there is a type, input type equals button, but we don't want to do that because that's the old way of doing things. Now buttons have their own specific tag that we want to use. We're going to say button type equals submit, and then buttons are special because they actually do have some content on them. They have text, and so we'll call it submit. So there we go. We've created our first form. It's going to have a place to specify your name, and then it's going to have a submit button. We've saved this. I'm going to go ahead and open it. Control-Shift-Q. And there we are. We've got our first name. Here's where we would type it in. Here's why it's good that we specified a label. When I click the label, it goes to the text field. And so having those two connected like that, where I said label, first name, and then the input, means that clicking on this, it knows it's part of this. That's always an important thing to do. And I could type in my name, and I can hit submit. Will submit do something? It does. Right now we haven't specified to do anything in particular, so it just reloads the page, and that's all it's going to do. You'll notice it puts a little question mark on the end of it too. We'll eventually explain what's going on there, but for now you don't have to worry about it. Let's put in a few more things here. You might have noticed when we do this, the first name and its input and the submit button are both on the same line. We don't necessarily want that. How do I force them to not be on the same line? I put a BR in there. And this is a case where you might actually start using BRs to do this. You also might want to use CSS to get these things onto separate lines. That would be a more appropriate thing. But we haven't gone there yet, so stick with just a BR in there right now. Let's make a few other things. Let's say we have here now gender. Input type equals, let's call it radio. For this, actually, let's do this right. Gender should not be inside the label because we want to label the radio button with its value. In this case, male for the first radio button. It's getting a little complicated, isn't it? So there we go. Label. What's an unhappy? Oh, I've got two closers there. Let's undo that. So there we go. We're going to say gender, and then we're going to give two possibles. We'll give male, and we'll give female. And these are going to be radio buttons. What's a radio button? You probably already know, but you'll see in a moment exactly what it is. And then we want the VR in there after that. So this whole thing right here is going to be kind of one input on its own line. Gender, male, female. And it'll allow you to select one or the other. What else can we do here? Let's do married. And this one can be a checkbox, like that. And so what are we going to have here now? We'll have first name. All right, I'll bite. Last name, let's have them both, right? And I really only want to break after the second one. So let's put both first name and last name on one line, and then we'll break. Gender is male, female, both radio. Then we'll break. Married is a checkbox. You either are or you aren't. Though it might be more complicated these days. And then there's a line break, and then a submit button. If you haven't caught up here, pause it right here. You can go through all of this and get caught up. Then I'm going to head on over, refresh, and take a look at what we got. There we are. We've got first name, last name. I'm very sorry. The formatting on this is horrible, but that's because we're just not ready for that yet. Seth, last name, Barrier. Gender, I'm a dude. These don't work quite right. We're going to have to work on that, aren't we? You've seen these before. These are called radio buttons, and we'll talk about them in a moment here. And I am married. And then I would hit submit, and everything resets back then. So these are called radio buttons. Radio buttons are something that has the state of on or off, but they're also presented in groups. Whenever you have a group of radio buttons, you need to make sure that only one of them can be active at a time. This goes back to the really old practice of having radios in cars where when you pressed a button for a particular station, all the other buttons would pop out. And so if I pressed the button for one station, the other buttons would pop out. And this was actually a complex little mechanical thing before they had all digital everything. So that's what the reference is. Basically, only one of these should be able to be active at a time. I obviously haven't done that right. We'll fix that in a moment, but for now, let's make sure everything's looking okay here. This is the basic format I want. Seeing this now, I hate the fact that these are on the same line, so I'm going to fix that. Let's put them on different lines. There we go. So there we go. This still looks pretty awful, but it's tolerable. We'll learn how to make these things look pretty later on, and really that's not what this class is about, so don't stress it too much. Let's keep moving here. We've got all the basics in here. There's one other thing that I want to do. Input tags are very important. These are actually a way for data to come into our program, and when we start doing things like JavaScript, it's going to be really important that we be able to find these quickly later on. And I want to be able to specifically find the one that's the first name, the one that's the last name, and so on and so forth. This is very similar to the concept of a variable. The data that's coming in as first name would want to be a variable with maybe the name first name, all one word. Let's do that. I'm going to say name equals first name. I'm going to use that camel case. If you haven't heard that word, that's just where you capitalize each word. I'm not going to put a space in there because I want it to be a variable name. This will more or less get it so that it is named that. I can use it that way. There's also one other thing that might be useful later on, and that's to give it an ID. Name and ID are different, but very often when you're creating inputs, you make them the same. They get treated differently in the way that they're consumed, but you still want to supply both. And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and make them the same. We'll see down the road why it's important to have both of these on an input. Let's go ahead and change this. Last name. It's complaining now because I have a duplicate ID. IDs have to be unique, just like variable names, so I need to change this one to be last name as well. And then down here, I would want a similar thing. I'm going to say the name of this equals gender. And now here's where I'm going to do something a little bit funky. Name equals gender. I'm going to give them both the same name. And that might help us here. Lastly, for checkbox, I'm going to give it name equals married and ID equals married. And up here, I should give these IDs as well. ID equals M gender and ID equals F gender. I cannot call them both give them both the ID gender because they have to be unique IDs. You can't have two tags with the same ID, but you can have them with the same name. Let's go ahead and save all that. If I come back over here now, I'm going to refresh this. Nothing really is visually changed. Let's see if it behaves differently at all. Checkbox, and then male, female. Oh, look at that. By giving them the same name, it knows that they're grouped together into one single set of radio buttons, and it will only let one of them be active at a given time. I can now hit submit, and something interesting is going to happen up here. It did just reload the same page, but now it put all that data right up here. First name equals Seth, last name equals Barrier, gender equals on, I'll need to fix that, and married equals on. Married equals on just means that it was checked. This is the essence of how forms are supposed to work. It takes all that data, it puts it in a format that you could then process if you needed to, and get all that data out. We won't be doing that for a while. That's something that'll come up much later where we'll use scripting to actually do stuff with all of that. But at least you see it showing up there. Let's fix one last thing. When it comes to gender, I don't want it to say on as in it's checked. It needs to be more specific than that. And to do that, I can tell it what value I want this one to have. I can say that the value here should equal capital M for male. And then for this one, I can say the value equals capital F for female. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, why do you have to do that? It's already labeled M and F. Well, yeah, but the label is just there for visual purposes. It's only there so that it can tell us, or the user can see what it's checking. Unless we set the value to be something unique, it doesn't actually get sent in the way we want it to. Let's go ahead and refresh this. And now if I check male and submit, notice it did still submit everything. First name equals nothing and last name equals nothing, but now it says gender equals M, male. Also notice married is not there because it's not checked, and so if it's not checked, it just doesn't send it. We can get the same effect here. If I load up a fresh page and just click submit, gender won't be submitted either because neither male nor female was checked. All of that's kind of unimportant, don't worry about it. The key thing to recognize is these tags that we're creating and all the attributes that we set on them. So let's go over these briefly here just to make sure you're comfortable. The form tag encloses everything. It lets it know that this is one form. It's important to use that because we will actually have multiple forms on pages at some point. Every form should have a submit button, usually at the bottom. And so we've put one in there, button type equals submit. A button is a type of input, so it does get a type. Submit is a special type of button. Most of the time we'll just say type equals button if it's not supposed to submit the form though. The text inside the button tag is what's displayed on the button. Up here, we have all these combinations of labels and inputs, and every input needs to be labeled. So first, we have a text input for your name. The label is first name, and then the input tag has three things: a type, a name, and an ID. And it's important that you include all three of those. Name does not need to be unique, though it usually is for a text one, but ID does. There can never be another tag with that same ID. We do the same thing for last name. The type is text, name is last name, ID is last name. Down here in gender, we create the radio buttons. We have two of them. We give them the same name so that it knows only one of those should be active at any given time. When this one is pressed down, we also tell it that its value should be M. We do have to give them unique IDs though. Now this is actually one where you might be able to get away with not giving it an ID, but we'll get more into that later on when that actually matters. Lastly, we have a checkbox. Its name is married, its ID is married. Here, the pattern is very much the same as what we had up here for an input because checkboxes are independent. You can have them as many of them as you want, and they can all be checked, they can none be checked, some, doesn't matter. They aren't like radio buttons where only one can be checked at a time. There are other kinds of inputs. I'll leave it up to you to explore those. And as I mentioned before, they're all listed over in the information on the W3 Schools reference.